evening. Glad to have you with us as we continue in our series on the world of the New Testament. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, Lord God, it's such a joy to gather together, and we're here in your blessed name. Help us to understand more of the world in which the New Testament was written, so that we can understand the New Testament better. Guide us in our thoughts, in our questions, in our discussions, and in this presentation, may the world in which you came be enlightening to us. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, the teacher in me could not resist the temptation, so we're going to have a quiz. What is it? You're going to have an artifact quiz. I used to do this with my students a lot. And we'll probably have one or two each week the rest of the time. But what do you think it is? Any guesses? And then I'll give you some clues. Yes?
A vase.
A vase. Kind of looks like one, doesn't it? Yes?
A vase.
A vase. I guess if you're from the south, it's a vase. If you're from the north, it's a vase. Okay. Yeah.
An urn?
An urn. Yeah, kind of looks like that.
Mortar and pestle.
Mortar and pestle. Okay, here comes your clue. It was found in the ruins of a Parthian village, which is modern Iraq, dating between 248 BC to 226 AD. It's about 5.5 inches high. It's a clay vessel. Inside was a copper cylinder held in place by asphalt, and inside of that was an oxidized iron rod.
Battery.
Aha, very good. This is the Baghdad Battery. It's about 2,000 years old. Dating between that period, they would fill it with an acid or alkaline liquid to produce an electric charge. Thought it might have been used for electroplating objects with gold. And this technology was lost for about 1,800 years until the invention of the modern battery. How about that? The Energizer Bunny goes way back. Okay, we'll have a couple more in the next week or two. Here's a drawing of what they think the inside of it would have looked like with the various parts. Interesting, interesting. I guess you could have used it for torture too. I don't know. Okay, in our series, there's 4 parts. Last week we looked briefly at basically the end of the Old Testament, very end of the Old Testament, with the Persian period, and then the period in between the Old and New Testament, which is about 400 years, called the intertestamental period. And we looked at the Greeks in that period as well. And we looked at some key things to help us understand something that's mentioned in the New Testament. In Galatians 4, it says, "In the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son." And the question I am seeking to address is, why that time? Why did God send His Son when He did? Why not sooner? Why not later? What was it about that time that made it the fullness of time? And as we've begun to see, and will continue to see, there's some factors I'm laying out as possible reasons why this was the most beneficial time for God to send His Son. And we'll be looking at some more of those this evening and next week, and then in our last time together, in our last session, we'll sort of pull that all together in our final review towards the end of the series. Come on, there we go. So, tonight, we're going to be in the Roman part of the world, from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And we're going to look at some key people and features of this. Now, Rome itself was established in the 8th century BC. And if you know anything of Roman mythology, there were 2 babies, twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were the sons of the god Mars. Mars was the god of war. And they were suckled by a she-wolf. And here you can see a bronze statue depicting this very scene. And everything was going great, and they wanted to build this new city, and they built this new city until it came time to name it. And each of them wanted the city named after themselves, and they fought over it. And Romulus killed his brother, And Rome was named after Romulus. That's where Rome got its name. So that's going way back with Roman history. Now originally, in Italy, in Rome, they were ruled by what were called Etruscan kings. And it was not going very well. The people didn't like that kind of government. And so they finally had a coup of sorts, I guess you could say, and kicked out the kings, but they still kept a lot of their culture. And a lot of the Roman culture comes back to the time of the Etruscan kings. Now, in the 6th century BC, there was a dictator. Rome allowed there to be temporary dictators during periods of emergency, especially. And there was a dictator by the name of Servius Tullus who ordered the very first census. And every 10 years, they would have a population count for the empire, or the world, or the region, for the purpose of taxation. This is where we have the idea of our census today, every 10 years. It came from the Romans. Okay, whoops, I gotta go back to Cincinnatus. There he is, okay. Now, they were allowed to be dictators for up to 6 months, originally. And there was a man by the name of Cincinnatus who came on the scene. He was a farmer, and there was an emergency. There was an imminent invasion by an enemy, and so he was appointed as the dictator. He could be dictator for 6 months. He served for 16 days, won the battle, and then he turned his armor over and went back to his farm. He could have stayed dictator for the rest of the 5.5 months or so, but he relinquished it and went back to his farm. Now, Cincinnati, Ohio is named after Cincinnatus, here from ancient Rome. Also, during our colonial days here in what would become the United States, George Washington really liked the person of Cincinnatus as far as a model for leadership. That he would lead during an emergency, and when it was over, relinquish power and return home. And so he looked at Cincinnatus as a role model, and that's exactly what George Washington did. Once he was a general, he led us in the Revolutionary War, but once things were taken care of and that was over with, he relinquished his power and he went back to Mount Vernon. Now, later on, he would become the first president. What you may or may not know, and it's hard to say in a lot of history classes these days, they have such a revisionist view of things, but our country was divided over what type of government it was going to have. Was it going to be what we know as a republic today, or were they going to have another monarchy? And it was pretty much a 50-50 split. Half the people wanted to have George Washington become the first king of this country. And I suppose if he was of a mind to, it could have happened, possibly. But he refused that because they fought against the king. They did not like the idea of a monarchy, and he didn't either. And so he relinquished that power. And we're going to see in our studies tonight with Rome, much of our form of government came after the Romans. When our founding fathers were trying to think in history of some form of government that would be good, they looked to the Roman Republic. And we're going to see that many of the features in the Roman Republic are going to sound very familiar to you if you're familiar with our form of government here. Okay, there were the Punic Wars. This was the wars that Rome had, 3 wars against Carthage. Carthage was a major city on the coast of North Africa, and there were 3 major wars. The second one, with a notable figure from the Carthaginians, was Hannibal. And it was in this encounter that Rome, for the first time, faced fighting elephants. And Carthage tried to attack Rome. They crossed the Mediterranean, went through Spain, crossed the Alps. All these elephants were in northern Italy itself, threatening Rome before had to retreat because Rome started to have their own attack against Carthage. And so Hannibal had to retreat to defend his homeland, but it was very close for the Carthaginians to take over Rome at that time. Now, the Roman Republic itself was governed by a constitution which centered on the principle of separation of powers, which we have today. Now, their groups were a little different and they're a little hard to make out in this, but they had their executive councils, they had a senate, there was veto power made available, and they had two main citizen groups, the patricians, which would be the wealthy class, and the plebeians, which were common folk. But they all had representation, and there was a separation of powers, so no one person or group would have too much power. And that's where we got the idea for our separation of powers in the United States, because we have three main bodies, don't we? We have the executive branch, we've got the legislative branch, and we've got the judicial branch, which would be the Supreme Court and the court system. Legislation is Congress. The executive is the president. And they have certain responsibilities, but no one group has all the power, so that nothing gets out of control. And this is where we got this idea, was from the ancient Romans. Now, their form of government they were very proud of, and throughout much of the Mediterranean and even into the Middle East, they would often inscribe on buildings that were built the abbreviation describing their government. And so you'd see this, what looks like an SPQR, which literally is Senatus Populus Q Romanus, which means the Senate and people of Rome. It was a government of the people when it was a republic. Now it's entirely different when it becomes an empire, and we'll be looking at that transition here in a few moments as well. But at this point in time, and we're before, let's see, it wouldn't be until the late 1st century BC that we transition from republic to empire. Okay. Now, there are four main principles that the Roman legal system was built upon. First, the accused is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Nowhere in the ancient world was this the case except during the Roman Republic. And even in many places today, this is not the case in many countries today. But we have that, don't we? You are presumed innocent until proven guilty. We got that from the Romans. The second principle they had is the accused could face his accuser and offer defense against the charges. Again, this sounds normal to us. It was not normal in the ancient world. Only the Roman Republic had this. A lot of times it was just at the whim of a ruler whether you lived or died, and it didn't matter whether you're innocent or not. But you had a right to face an accuser and have a defense for yourself. We got that from the Romans. Guilt had to be established through clear evidence. It couldn't be simply by whim or hearsay or rumor. There had to be clear evidence. There had to be some substantiating facts of some sort. And we've sort of come up with the phrase in our criminal system, what? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, it has to be clear evidence with regards to these things. And judges could interpret laws and were expected to make fair decisions. And this was the intent, I think, of our founding fathers when they came up with the judicial branch for separation of powers, was that the judiciary was to go through and help to interpret the laws. Now, you may wonder about that these days. It seems like you may have an opinion that sometimes it seems like the judicial branch is trying to make laws instead of just interpret laws. But the intent was the same, and they were intending to have a just decision, to make a fair decision. If you have a good judge, you're more likely to have that. You have a bad judge, someone pays him under the table or something, you may not get a good decision. But the intent is there. And this is where we got a lot of the framework for our judiciary here in the United States. Now, at the end of the Republic, we come to a period of transition of some 30, 40 years in the, what would be around 90 to about 50 BC, the century before Christ. And the Republic is in turmoil. Different senators of the Roman Senate were backing different generals. The generals would have legions throughout their lands, throughout the Republic. And so these 2 or 3 senators might back this general, these 2 or 3 might back this one. And the generals basically had too much power. They had too much power. And it got to a point where they were on the verge of civil war, of this general fighting this general with his armies, because each one wanted power over Rome. And Julius Caesar came on the scene, along with some others, Pompey and some others. He was sort of sent to the far reaches of their republic, the far part of their empire, if you will, to what's modern-day Spain. It used to be Gaul. And he was outnumbered 5-1 and still won with his strategy and his charisma with his men. And he was noted for the line, I came, I saw, I conquered. And so he took over Gaul. Pompey and others were nervous that Julius Caesar was getting too much power. And so they had the Senate order him back to Rome. Now, the general could come back to Rome, but his army could not. They did not bring their legions back to Rome like an invading army. They were not supposed to do that. And there was a boundary. It was the Rubicon River. And you were not to cross the Rubicon with your legions. You could cross and come as the leader and the general, but you could not bring your armies. Well, Julius Caesar knew that if he went back to Rome without his army, he was going to be killed. And so he did the unthinkable that was only thought of once before and did not succeed. And that was he took his legions, crossed the Rubicon River, and he marched on Rome itself with his legions. So there's all this internal power struggle towards the end of the Republic. And he sought to stabilize things by becoming the first emperor. He wanted to cut the power of the Senate to where it would just be a puppet figurehead that had very little power, and that he would be the ultimate leader, dictator, emperor, if you will, of a new Roman Empire. And he was intending on doing that, but he was assassinated. And there's a whole drama. You could go in the history books and even in Hollywood and see some of the movies on the assassination of Julius Caesar and so forth. But he was assassinated. His right-hand man was Mark Antony. And Mark Antony, after a few years of seeking out those who had killed Julius Caesar, various senators, and it took a few years, had an uneasy alliance, his armies, with those of Octavian. Octavian was Julius Caesar's nephew. Julius Caesar had no son by a Roman wife, although he had a son by a queen of Egypt known as, anybody want to guess? Cleopatra the Seventh. There were 7 Cleopatras. Cleopatra the Seventh. He had an affair, had a son with her. But when Julius Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra went back to Egypt, somewhat fearful for the life of her son now, and would feel pretty safe in Egypt. Egypt was perhaps one of the wealthiest countries that was in alliance with Rome. And Egypt had a fair military machine as well. So she retreated back to Egypt. Well, civil war broke out between Octavian, Julius Caesar's nephew, and Mark Antony, who was Julius Caesar's right-hand man and general. And Mark Antony's forces and his resources were dwindling, but Egypt was nearby. And so he goes to Egypt, forms an alliance with Cleopatra, marries her, and has more resources, military might, and other resources to pay his armies to continue the fight against Octavian. And there was a naval battle, the Battle of Actium, in which these two forces came to a head to fight. Now, Mark Antony had very rarely, if at all, engaged in naval warfare. He was a land army general. And so his tactics on sea didn't fare too well as they would on land, because there's a whole different strategy you need on sea than on land. And Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. They returned to Egypt, where they ultimately died there. Cleopatra allegedly committed suicide by getting a poisonous asp to bite her, and then later Mark Antony. So Octavian took over. This really marked the end, for sure, of the Roman Republic. And we're going to look at a couple of things here with regards to Octavian. But all future emperors would take the name of Caesar as the title of office for the emperor. So when someone says they appeal to Caesar, or whoever becomes Caesar, Caesar from this point forward is not a name. It's a title of office. Like we would say President Obama. President isn't a name, it's a title of office. So from this point on, we have all these Caesars. So it's a title of office. And the first one we're going to see, we talked a little bit about Cleopatra already. Let's go on. Is Octavian. The Senate voted him the title Augustus. Does that sound familiar? We hear it probably every December during the Christmas season. Caesar Augustus issued a decree that everyone should go to their own hometown to be taxed for the census. And this is why Mary and Joseph had to leave Galilee and go to Bethlehem. This is the same guy. Octavian is Augustus. When he became emperor, he took on the name Caesar Augustus, which literally means exalted one. Think he thought highly of himself? Would seem to. So this marked the beginning of the Roman Empire. And it's under his reign that we have the coming and the birth of Christ and his life and the early part of the New Testament. The earliest part of the New Testament emerges during his reign. Now, there's some interesting things. This also marked the beginning of what's known as the Pax Romana. This was a period of about 200 years of relative peace throughout much of Europe and the known world. There were no superpowers to contend with Rome. There may have been a little skirmish here and there with some belligerent tribe, but there was no other big superpower to contend with Rome. And so there was a period of relative peace. And as we consider that, isn't it interesting? Because in all the history of the world, there's been very, very, very few times of a lengthy period of peace. We're talking 200 years. That was very unusual in the ancient world, for there to be that long a period of relative peace. And it's during this time, in the fullness of time, God sends forth his Son, who would become the Prince of Peace. We often hear, don't we? And it's during this period of time. And if there's peace, relative peace, wouldn't that also help to facilitate the spreading of a gospel message? You could travel throughout much of the Roman Empire in much greater safety than perhaps before. So there's another factor, perhaps, in why Jesus came when he did. So the Roman Empire under Augustus, let's look at that a little bit more here. He opened high-level jobs to men of any class and even made taxes more fair. How could he make taxes more fair? Because as a general rule, he had an idea of let's embellish the empire we have more than try to expand it. Expansion meant armies going out to invade. So they did not have too much invading other territories. There was a little bit, but not nearly to the degree that they had with all these generals before. So he had an infrastructure campaign. He would hire people to help build roads or repair roads and aqueducts and all kinds of buildings and build new city buildings all throughout the empire. So he hired a lot of people for these tasks. He issued new coinage to improve trade. He also set up the very first postal system, to which we are indebted to this day. The idea of sending mail or communications that anybody could do, not just leaders. And so there was the first postal system set up. And he put many of the jobless to work building infrastructure in the kingdom. Now, here you can see a statue. That didn't come out right, did it? Statue of Augustus. What was his name before he became emperor? Octavian, yes. And he was related to Julius Caesar how? His nephew. Okay. Now, here's a map of the Roman Empire from roughly the time of Augustus. Had most of all of Europe, part of Britannia, just about all of North Africa, and even into parts of Mesopotamia. Now, to the far east was the Parthian Empire. They're a fairly powerful empire themselves, but they didn't really launch into many wars against Rome, and Rome didn't launch into them. There'd be some skirmishes and so forth. But the eastern part of the Roman Empire is right through here, and what's in the middle of it? Israel. Israel was the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And they set up many city-states and garrisons among many of these Greco-Roman cities that they established. There was a group of cities called the Decapolis, which literally means 10 cities. Initially, it was 10 cities that Rome had built along this eastern empire to sort of serve as eyes along the border here toward the east. So they had a line of these cities. Now, the 10 cities grew to about 18 or 19 cities, but it was called the Decapolis. And we do have mention in the Gospels on a couple of occasions, it mentions the Decapolis, that some people from the Decapolis came to see Jesus. That would be from some of these regions or some of these cities bordering the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Okay, let's briefly look at a couple of other emperors. After Caesar Augustus, we have Tiberius from about 14 to 37 AD. This is the Caesar at the time of Christ's ministry, when Jesus was ministering. He was the second emperor, capable military leader himself on his own right. He held treason trials against different people, which was kind of unusual. I mean, if someone was thought to be treasonous, he could have just simply said, "Off with your head." But he would hold trials. There were some elements of the Republic that came over into the Roman Empire. Citizens still had some degree of rights. They had a right for trial and a hearing before any judgment was placed. The Apostle Paul took advantage of this on at least one occasion, if not more, because he was a Roman citizen. And at one place, he was beaten and thrown in jail without a hearing. And when the local leaders heard that he was a Roman citizen, they were very nervous because they could have been liable for punishment for whipping a Roman citizen before he had a hearing or a trial and offer a defense for himself. So Paul used that on occasion, not so much just for his own safety, but to help the church in that area and bring protection to it. Because when he left, those leaders, knowing what they had done wrong, were less likely to oppress the local church that had been established. And so he had used that on occasion. Now, I want to look at a text in Matthew 22. 22:15. The Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words, speaking about Jesus. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. It could very likely have been a coin similar to this that they had seen, because on the coinage, they would always have the emperor's image. And when a new emperor came on the scene, all the new coins that were going to be minted would have his image. And so we have mentioned in the text of Caesar's image on the coin. And so it would have probably been the Emperor Tiberius that might have been the image of that coin. Okay, then we have Gaius, also known as Caligula. His name literally means little boots. Isn't that sweet? Was his mom so gracious to name him Little Boots? This guy was a nutcase. He had incest with his sisters. He would have people just killed at a whim. He ordered some women to come before him and have sex with horses and donkeys and goats and stuff like that in his presence. I mean, this guy was a nutcase, okay? He was out there. And he ordered a statue of himself set up in the temple in Jerusalem. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. The Jews would not tolerate that. Now, fortunately, I guess if you were a Jew at that time, you'd be glad that he was assassinated before that order was fulfilled. But the order was given. Now, in the book of Acts, the first persecutions that the church faced was not against the Romans or by the Romans. It was by the Jews. It was Jewish persecution of the church. Saul, who would become Paul, was persecuting the church violently, having them thrown into jail, stood by while Stephen was stoned to death, many of them put to death. The Jews were heavily persecuting the church. Now, in Acts 9:31, there's a verse that comes along sort of out of the blue, it seems like, and it says, So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace and was being built up. And walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it multiplied. How did there all of a sudden have this period of peace without being persecuted from the Jews? Well, I think it might have been because of Little Boots. Because of Caligula and his order of setting up his statue in the temple and his campaign against the Jews in Judea. The Jewish leadership had a bigger fish to worry about than the church at this time, because they could not tolerate the idea of the Lord's temple being blasphemed and an abomination set up there, the statue of an emperor or some other god. And so their attention was distracted for a time to try to deal with Rome, and the church got to catch its breath. And it says here, it had peace and it multiplied. It mentions the comfort of the Holy Spirit and it multiplied. I think that's why there was this period of peace from the Jews. Okay. Now, Caligula, in this time with what we have in Acts 9, this is soon after Saul's conversion. So Saul is now converted, and the Jews' attention is turned to Rome. One of their chief persecutors of the church is now a member of the church. And so the one who may have been the fiercest leader of persecuting the church is now, it's ceased. There is no persecution from that one. And their attention's turned to Rome. So these are some factors maybe for peace for the church for a period of time. Then we come up with Caesar Claudius, Emperor Claudius. He was an uncle to Caligula. He had some physical deformities. his wife fed him poisonous mushrooms. Well, where do you see the family dynamics we have here? She fed him poisonous mushrooms so that her son Nero could become emperor. So his wife kills him so her son can become the emperor. Somebody needs some marital counseling. Bad. Okay. But anyway, that was the case with Claudius. So Claudius eats the mushrooms and he's gone. Then we come to Nero. Nero conspires to have his mother killed. Remember, the very mother who had her husband killed so Nero could be emperor, he now has his own mother killed. Is this a dysfunctional family or what? And Nero's something of a nutcase himself, maybe not quite as perverted in the head as Little Boots, but he had some other issues as well. He conspired to have Rome burned. Now, scholars are split over whether or not Nero had some role in it, but I believe he did, because it was very clear that he wanted to totally rebuild Rome from scratch. And the citizenry just did not like that. Totally tear it down and start over. And rebuild it in his mind's eye the way he wanted it. Well, that wasn't going to fly with the citizenry. So I think he probably had a little behind-the-scenes conspiracy going on for Rome to be burning, and then he used the Christians as the scapegoat and blamed them for the burning of Rome. So we have a localized persecution of the church in Rome being blamed for burning Rome. About a third of Rome burned down, and he could then begin his idea of trying to rebuild much of Rome at that time. Peter and Paul possibly and very likely their lives ended during the reign of Nero. When Paul appealed to Caesar, when he was at Caesarea, he was before the Roman governors, and the Jewish leaders wanted to have him brought back to Jerusalem. Paul says, I am where I need to be, I'm before the authority of Rome, and he said, I appeal to Caesar. Now, once you as a Roman citizen appealed to Caesar, the local leaders had no choice but to send you to Caesar. So he makes his appeal to Caesar, sort of like making an appeal to the Supreme Court, if you will. Nero was the Caesar at this time. So think about that for a moment. This Nero, who may have blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome and the persecution of Christians, is the Caesar, most likely, that Paul would have to stand before when he appealed. What's that tell you about Paul? It tells me he had a strong faith because he knew he wanted to go to Rome to build up the saints there. There were already Christians in Rome, but he just felt he wanted to go to Rome. I don't think he originally intended to go as a prisoner, but God uses circumstances, sometimes beyond our understanding, to get us where we need to be. And so even if it's as a prisoner, he's rejoicing because he's finally getting to go to Rome. And he would be under house arrest for a couple, 3 years there. And the book of Acts seems to end rather abruptly. And it may have been because this was when Paul's life ended at Rome. The last we know, he was at Rome, and that was it. And for Peter too. And according, it's not mentioned in the scriptures, but according to much in church traditions, Peter went to Rome and was crucified upside down in Rome because he did not feel worthy to be crucified as Jesus, as his Lord. And so they crucified him upside down, according to some church traditions. Now, oh yeah, let's talk about his games. He liked to play in the games, you know, like chariot races and things, and he was always declared the winner, even if he didn't. You know, he crashed his chariot, didn't finish the race, he was still declared the winner. Okay? People were really fearful of Nero. You don't say anything negative against Nero. He always wins. Okay? Or you'll lose your head. Type thing. So he always won. Now, after he was dead, they recanted all his victories. But at the time, he did. Oh yeah, he also hired people to applaud his music. He wasn't very good, from what we understand, but he thought he was. And so he hired people to applaud when he played. Okay. Just so that it would have the appearance that he was a great musician because of all this applause and so forth. So he was a bit of a nutcase himself. Now, the outfit he's wearing here, if you look at this is not typical Roman. Except for the fact that he's missing an arm on the statue. There would have been one there. But this is a Greek uniform of sorts. It's actually a depiction of Alexander the Great. Nero sort of saw himself as a reincarnation of Alexander the Great. And he would dress in ancient Greek garb like Alexander the Great to sort of show off his greatness, in a sense. Vespasian. Now we're getting a little closer toward the end of the Old Testament, or end of the New Testament. And with Vespasian, he was appointed to suppress the first Jewish revolt. In the mid to late 60s AD, the Jews revolted against Rome. And he was the general in charge of that at the beginning of the revolt. Now, during the years of that revolt, he became emperor. And he would pass that responsibility on to his son Titus, who would then become the next emperor later. But anyway, in 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by his son Titus. So this is the emperor during the time of the first Jewish revolt, which lasted from about 65 to 73 AD. And in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, the Romans carry off all the furnishings of the temple, and there has not been a Jewish temple built since, even to this day. So it was destroyed at this time by Vespasian. Now, he also would give some financial resources to some historians called Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, and Pliny the Elder. Now, Josephus was actually a Jewish general during the Jewish revolt. And he was captured in the early years of the Jewish revolt. But he was also a scholar and a historian. And he was put on the payroll, if you will, of Vespasian. Keep your enemies close to understand their ways, was the tactic. And befriend them, in a sense. Josephus is a very valuable historian to those who study ancient history, antiquities, and so forth. He wrote a lot. This whole volume is an antiquity of the Jews, the wars of the Jews, and things of that sort. And he does mention something of the church. He does mention Christ in here as well. But he was a first century historian. So much of what archaeologists and historians will look at, what are sources, especially for biblical scholars, outside the Bible from that time, which may give some credence to things in the Bible. So there are names, places, and events that Josephus mentions that collaborate names, places, and events in the New Testament. And so that gives the weight of the New Testament even more credibility because it actually occurred during a time and place in history. It wasn't just made up. And so someone who was apart from it, from Christianity and the Bible, writes about some of the same people and events with regards to that. So Josephus is a valuable resource for ancient historians and so forth. Now mine's not that old. If you want to see an older version, go see Karen. She came walking in here with a 1917 version of Josephus. But very valuable tool with Josephus. Titus, Emperor Titus. He finished the campaigns of the Jewish revolt. It's during his reign, about 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupts back in Italy. And at the foot of Mount Vesuvius are two cities, Pompeii and Herculaneum. And it erupted so abruptly and so quickly that much of the citizenry could not escape. And the city was just covered almost instantly in layers and layers and layers of hot volcanic ash. Archaeologists were thrilled because when they got through all that ash, they found a city almost totally undisturbed in time and place, to help them understand something of those cities in the first century. And much of it was still standing when they got through all that ash. So they were very thrilled about that. He was known for his generosity. The Colosseum was built during his reign. They'd have 100 days of games during the year. It'd be like 100 holidays. Now, I don't know how many holidays we have on our calendar. I don't think there's that many. There might be too many, but there's not that many. But think of 100. It'd be like, what? Almost 30% of the year. It's like every third or fourth day there's a holiday. And they'd have games or something going on. Now, these images here, this is a victory arch, which is in Rome. You can see it today. Many of the emperors would establish and build these victory arches at various major cities. There's one in Paris and so forth, but this one's in Rome. And one of the scenes along one of the walls here is this picture here of the destruction of Jerusalem and Roman soldiers carrying away furnishings of the temple. Now, what's this here? That's the lampstand. Remember the seven golden lamps in the lampstand for the temple of the Lord. And what is obviously missing from the scene, there is nothing of the Ark of the Covenant. Nothing. Now, why is that? Where is it? We know that Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. It's some think that maybe the Babylonians took it, or that it was hidden from the Babylonians before they came to Jerusalem. There are some who believe that it's still under the Temple Mount today. There are some who believe it's in a particular religious shrine in ancient Nubia, which is modern-day Ethiopia. You can find all kinds of documentaries on all these views. Now, I don't think it's any of those. I don't think it's going to be found, because the Bible tells us where it is. If you go to the book of Revelation, in Revelation 11:19, it says, "Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail." Sounds to me like God took it. And it's up there. It's with him in heaven. Now, unlike Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I would debate his style of archaeology. I don't think it was so much archaeology as it was treasure hunting. But anyway, I don't think it's going to be found. I don't think it's going to be found. But there are some out there who are still looking for it. And why might it be a bad thing for it to be found, if it were to be found? Any ideas?
People worship it.
People will worship it like an idol. It's like people, I mean, we already know this from other so-called artifacts that have claimed to have been found. People coming from Asia Minor claiming to have pieces of Noah's Ark, and they make shrines with these pieces. During the Crusades, soldiers come back to Europe with pieces of wood, claiming it to be pieces of the cross of Jesus, and they make shrines and altars for all these things. Now, if you took all the wood that was brought back during the Crusades and claimed to be a piece of the cross, you could build hundreds of crosses. But people get attached to the stuff. And in the New Covenant, We do not serve a God who needs a temple built by brick or stone. We are His temple. The Holy Spirit lives within us. So our body is a temple in that sense. And so it says in Revelation, it's in heaven. If I believe the Scriptures to be inspired, and I do, I have to take that for what it says. Okay, let's go on. Toward the very end of the New Testament period, we have Domitian. This gets us up to the very close of the New Testament. John wrote Revelation around 95, 96 AD. So with Domitian, we really come to the end of the New Testament period. He was hailed as a Lord and God. Many of the emperors, some of them even demanded emperor worship. They claimed to be gods or a son of a god. This was not unusual in the ancient world. Even in Egypt and Mesopotamia, many rulers claimed to be divine or have divine connections in that sense and be worshipped. There was emperor worship, there was pharaoh worship, there was all kinds of worship of ancient rulers. But this would not go well with the Jews or Christians. Now, concerning the Jews and Christians, they had to pay a tax to continue to worship because they were illegal religions. Unless Rome officially sanctioned you as a religion, you were illegal. And so they had to pay special taxes. Now, exactly how this would be collected and enforced among the church, I'm not sure. Among the Jews, it might be easier because they're sort of centered in Jerusalem. But the church was all over the place. So during really the first 2 centuries after the time of Christ, it was illegal to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. There were no church buildings built until the mid-late 3rd century. They met in homes. I mean, imagine, if your faith is illegal, okay, they're right there on 5th Street in Covington. They know right where to come to get us, wouldn't they? So you couldn't build your own buildings. So they met in a lot of homes, and the New Testament bears that out. They met in homes oftentimes. In time, as the Roman Empire began to get a little bit more sympathetic for Christianity, they started to expand homes and add walls, and a home might be converted into a church facility of some sort. And then, with the emergence of Constantine in the early 4th century, we had the beginning of the Christianized Roman Empire and the start of what might be called the Byzantine Empire at that time. So that brings us to an end of emperors. Now I want to talk briefly about some major Roman achievements. And the first I want to look at are Roman mosaics. Mosaics are little cubed tiles of different colors that are individually placed to make these beautiful designs and images and geometric designs. All kinds of floors. And if you wet it, as you see this guy doing, the colors just come out very vibrant. I've got some tiles up here, some actual tessera tiles, mosaic tiles. They come in various sizes, but an average size, a large one would be like the size of dice. This is a fairly large one. A small one, and this one, these got some color here. That's small. I've got some that are still plastered together. A couple of pieces with several different colors of things plastered together here. Mosaic floor tiles. The Romans, and then later in the Byzantine period, these are all over the place. And they had a lot of images of nature. A lot of Byzantine churches would have mosaic floors. And we also see the influence of astrology in the early church, because some of these mosaic floors would have the 12 signs of the astrology on the floor of their church. And they would try to associate that, I suppose, in some fashion, of the 12 tribes of Israel or the 12 disciples. I'm not exactly sure. But we see some of that influence even at that time. But beautiful mosaic floors and artistry. Now, Here's one I really like. At the center, you see that face? That's the god Bacchus, Roman god Bacchus. He's the god of wine. Get drunk and let's have a big party. Woo! That's who that is. Now, look at this geometric design. Now, probably the size of this is maybe twice the size of this curtain. And it's the floor. Well, here, we're going to have a little test. It might be a little more difficult for you over here, but those of you that are sort of head on to this, pardon the pun, I want you to focus your eyes just at the head. Just look at the head, just look at the head, and just keep looking at it for 30 seconds to a minute and see if something happens. So I'm going to give you a moment. Just stay at the head. Stay at the head. Just stay at the head. Anybody see anything happening?
Yeah.
Does it look like it's moving?
Yes.
Yeah. If you're straight on, this test it's whoa, it looks like it's moving. It's kind of cool, isn't it? Isn't that kind of a trick of the eyes?
Tripping out.
Well, if you keep your focus on Bacchus, things really get psychedelic. Things really move. Now, if we put, I guess, an image of the cross or something there, we could use it for an illustration for us, couldn't we? Keep your focus on the cross and life happens. And things move. It's kind of cool. Kind of cool. Okay, aqueducts. The Romans were really big on their luxury. We saw the mosaic tiles. They also built bathhouses and sauna rooms. They're very much into hygiene and trying to stay fairly clean, and so they needed water. So they built these huge bridge-like structures. This is a double one. Most of them were singles. This is a double one with gutters at the top, plastered gutters or cement gutters, because the Romans came up with and designed cement and concrete, to bring water from outlying areas to the cities. Now, if you were wealthy enough, or important enough, you could have one branch off and brought right to your own villa, to bring the water right to you. But most people did not have that. But each town would have a location in town where the water would be brought to, and you could go to that central location to get this water. And it would be brought there. So water aqueducts are still standing in a lot of Europe and the Middle East. There are very few of them still being used, but there are a couple, I think. But many parts of them are still available to be seen. And here is Michelle and I at an aqueduct at Caesarea by the Sea in Israel. Caesarea was the Roman capital of Israel. A lot of things happened, particularly in the book of Acts at Caesarea. Paul went before Felix and Festus at Caesarea. Cornelius became a Christian when Peter went to visit him at Caesarea. Philip wound up here in Acts with his daughters for a time. A lot of things happened at Caesarea. It was the Roman capital. They got a hippodrome there. There's a Roman theater there, which is still being used to this day. They have restored it. They still have concerts and festivals and so forth. And many other structures there. It was a major Roman city. But the water would run in channels up along the top. And this just goes for miles along the beach. Roman roads, very, very important as well. On the left you see a mile marker. Many of the Roman roads would have a mile marker every mile, or at least what the Romans considered a mile. Now a Roman mile may not be the exact distance of what our mile is today, but the principle is still true. They would have mile markers. Here's a couple of Roman roads. Here's one with a gutter, rain gutter in the middle. And I'm going to show you something else here in a minute. But mile markers. Do we have mile markers today? Yes. You get out on that interstate, and every mile there's that little green sign with a number, isn't it? It's either counting up or counting down, depending on which way you're going. But we have mile markers to give us some idea of distance or how far we've gone or how far yet to go, wherever our destination might be. So I've already learned that we're close to mile marker 8 exit. Here at Covington, and then the other one I think is 4, or the pilot station and the beef houses. So So when I'm on interstate, I'm thinking 4 or 8, you know, to get there. So this is a mile marker. Sometimes they have inscriptions on them to say of a local town or how far to a local town. Now, in Matthew 5:41, Jesus speaking on the Sermon on the Mount says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Kind of an odd saying, isn't it? What do you mean, force me to go 1 mile? Well, here's why. Under the Roman Empire, any Roman soldier and many citizens could require some subjugated peoples to take their stuff for 1 mile. So if you were a Jew and not a citizen of Rome, and a Roman soldier came up and dropped his gear and said, take it, you're carrying it for the next mile, you were obligated to do so. And then when you came to that next mile marker, you could drop it and go on your way. But it says here, it forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Why? Why would you want to do that? Think for a moment. You pass that 1 mile marker and you're still carrying it, it's going to get their attention. Why is he carrying it further than he needs to? And it may give you an opportunity to share Christ. You've got to go beyond what the obligation is to show compassion and love and concern for others. And I think that's in part what he's saying here. You know, go the extra mile. And it may give them pause to think, why are they doing this? And it gives you an opportunity to share your faith. So that's kind of cool. Here's a couple more Roman roads. This one I think is part of the Appian Way near Rome. And if you look, these have been partially restored. They're in pretty good shape. Okay. Let's move on real quick. Running out of time. This is one at Beth Shan in Israel, also known as Scythopolis. It was one of the cities of the Decapolis. It was the only city of the Decapolis that was west of the Jordan River. All the others were east of the Jordan River. But I've been here a few times. And you can see the Roman columns. The style of the figureheads on the columns, the capitals, can give us an idea of the period of history, because artistic styles changed. And if you had a Corinthian style, it was usually around the 2nd century A.D. If it was an Ionic style, it was usually common in the 1st century A.D. For this part of the world. And these up here are Ionic. So these are 1st century columns. We see this road, which is arched. You see this hump in the middle, this line of stones arched up in the middle. And then this is another road, and you see this round stone. Anybody have any idea what that is? Why is there this round stone ever so often at various increments in the road? It's a manhole. It's to the Romans that we are indebted to having a sewer system. The sewer system is under the road, and they had a couple of different ways of accessing it. Just like we have manholes, I bet some of you probably passed over some manholes, maybe without even realizing it, maybe just to get here tonight. But why are they there? So that people can get down in there and address any issues or clogs in the system. And so many times they had the round ones at various locations. On this road, they just got a constant ridge. So if you know the exact location, you just pull over that stone right there and you're right at it. You don't have to worry about it being 10, 15, 20 feet away or between the two manholes. So we have a sewer system with regards to these roads. The Roman roads provided a lot of trade and safety. Safety in that you could more easily get to various parts of the empire. There was peace because of the Pax Romana. Again, I think these are contributing factors of why it was the fullness of time for Jesus to come. Add to that what we studied about the Greeks last week, a common language throughout most of the world. so I can write the New Testament in Greek. And most of the people in the known world were familiar with Greek. So a lot of factors contributed to that as well. They also developed concrete. The Colosseum was made of it. Here's an example of Roman concrete here. Piece of it. Neat stuff. Okay, so some factors regarding this. The Greek language facilitates the spread of the gospel. Roman roads connecting cities makes it easier and faster to travel on land. The Pax Romana, relative peace, no major military campaigns. All these contributing to something that's coming. Christ and His church. And in the early years of the church, it made it a lot easier to spread the gospel throughout the Roman Empire because of some of these factors. So, next week we're going to look at the political and religious influences in Israel. We'll look at the Herodian dynasty and some of the Roman authorities that we're most familiar with in Scripture itself, in the Gospels. And let me just highlight a couple of things I have up here. Oops. Well, that took down. The two lamps that are burning, the one on this side is a Herodian oil lamp from the 1st century in the time of Christ. This one is a Byzantine oil lamp. So this is going to run probably from about 250 to 400 AD. This one, the 1st century. And if you come up here, you'll see there's some oil in my plate. It's not that it's seeping or leaking, it's that I overfilled it. And when it got to the wick at the end, it just started dripping over the edge. That's why I put the plate there, in case I do something silly and don't want to make a mess. But they're still burning very well. I've got some Roman coinage here. I have one of a deified Constantine, one with a chariot on the back of it and so forth. I have some actual Roman spike and Roman coffin handle from some tomb excavations I was involved in. They don't look all that great, but you can come look at them. I mean, they're a couple thousand years old. Take that into account when you look at these things. But I've seen some modern ones that look worse than these. And I still have my Hellenistic lamp. There's a piece of Roman marble up here. And also some glassware. There's a little glass vial, and I have to be very careful because it's very thin. And much of the color has worn off, but you can still see some of the coloring that would have been on the whole thing of the jar, this little vial. And I have what's called glass slag. One of the sites that I had opportunity to be on excavations with was Avila in North Jordan. And they found lots of this glass slag. It's the discards of what they were not going to use in making Roman glass. And some of it's still attached to stone. And they found just piles and piles of this. And they think that that city at one point in time may have had a major industry of glass making, of Roman glass for that region of the empire. And so there's some fragments of the glass slag here, and a little jar you can put your perfume or lotion in from that time as well. Any questions this evening? Yes, ma'am.
Was that blown glass? Did they blow the glass, or was it molded?
Was it blown glass or was it molded? Both. Sometimes they would blow it, and sometimes it would be with various molds. It just depended on the region and the artisans of that area and with regards to what they would do. And if you've seen glass blowing, that's quite a thing just to watch. That's quite an art to do, and it is not easy. They make it look easy, but it is not. It is very difficult. I'd be messing up all the time. My pile of slag would be like this high, probably with one piece of glass. But yes, very good question. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And you can turn that off. And we'll